The summer of 1987 was particularly brutal in rural Nebraska, with temperatures soaring past 90 degrees for weeks on end. The drought had left the cornfields brittle and brown, creating a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly under the merciless sun. 6-year-old Becca Collins had been excited about the county fair that Saturday afternoon for weeks, circling the date on the kitchen calendar with a red crayon and asking her mother Linda every morning if it was fair day yet. That morning, Becca had insisted on wearing her favorite yellow sundress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem, a dress that Linda had sewn herself during the long winter months when the farm work slowed down. The fabric was soft cotton, bright as sunshine, and it made Becca's strawberry blonde hair shine like spun gold in the morning light. Linda had spent extra time braiding her daughter's hair, weaving a matching yellow ribbon through the plaits, while Becca sat patiently at the kitchen table, swinging her legs and humming a song she'd learned at Sunday school. The Collins family farm sat on 40 acres of Nebraska prairie, inherited from Tom's grandfather, who had homesteaded the land in the 1920s. It wasn't a wealthy operation. Tom raised cattle and grew corn, struggling like most small farmers to make ends meet in an increasingly corporate agricultural world. But it was home, and it was honest work, and Tom took pride in maintaining the traditions that his family had built over generations. Linda supplemented their income by taking in sewing work from neighbors, her Singer sewing machine humming late into the evening as she altered wedding dresses and hemmed school uniforms. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity as families from 3 counties gathered for the annual celebration that had been a tradition for over 50 years. Becca clutched her father Tom's calloused hand as they wandered past the ring toss games and cotton candy stands, her brown eyes wide with wonder at the flashing lights of the Ferris wheel that towered above the dusty fairgrounds like a mechanical giant. The air hung thick with the scent of funnel cakes and hay, mixed with the diesel fumes from the carnival rides and the distant aroma of barbecue smoke from the 4-H food tent. Tom Collins was a man of few words but deep feelings, his weathered hands telling the story of 38 years of hard work under the Nebraska sun. He had married Linda straight out of high school, and they had spent their entire adult lives on the farm, dreaming of the day when they might expand their operation or perhaps take a real vacation somewhere beyond the county lines. Becca was their miracle baby, born after years of trying and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages that had left Linda convinced she would never be a mother. If you're enjoying this story of mystery and hope, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more incredible true stories like this one. Around 3 in the afternoon, with the sun beating down mercilessly on the packed dirt of the fairgrounds, Tom had stepped away to use the restroom facilities near the main exhibition hall. The portable facilities were located behind the livestock barn, a good 2-minute walk from where he had left Becca with her mother near the petting zoo. Linda was deeply engrossed in conversation with her sister Margaret, discussing the upcoming church potluck and the recent troubles with Margaret's teenage son, who had been caught drinking behind the school gymnasium. The petting zoo was Becca's favorite attraction, a small enclosed area where children could interact with baby goats, lambs, and a gentle pony named Buttercup. She had been giggling with delight as a particularly adventurous kid goat tried to eat the yellow ribbon from her hair, her laughter ringing out clear and joyful above the general din of the fair. Linda had glanced over at her daughter periodically, smiling at Becca's pure happiness as she gently stroked the animals and whispered secrets into their fuzzy ears. When Linda finally turned around after her conversation with Margaret had run longer than intended, she expected to see her daughter still crouched beside the fence, probably trying to convince the baby goats to let her braid flowers into their fur. Instead, she found only empty space where Becca had been standing just moments before. The yellow dress that should have made her daughter impossible to miss among the crowd was nowhere to be seen. "Becca?" Linda called, her voice carrying a note of mild concern that quickly escalated to panic as she scanned the immediate area. "Becca, honey, where are you?" The petting zoo attendant, a teenage boy named Danny who worked part-time for the traveling carnival, looked up from feeding the animals. He remembered seeing the little girl in the yellow dress just minutes before, but couldn't recall exactly when she had left or in which direction she might have gone. The crowds were thick around the animal exhibits, with dozens of families moving in and out of the area throughout the afternoon. Margaret immediately began searching the nearby game booths and food stands, calling Becca's name and asking other fairgoers if they had seen a little girl in a yellow dress. When Tom returned from the restroom and found Linda in a state of near hysteria, he immediately took charge, his farmer's practicality overriding the growing fear in his chest. They split up, each taking a different section of the fairgrounds, while Margaret stayed near the petting zoo in case Becca returned on her own. The initial search was frantic but organized, with fair volunteers and off-duty police officers who were attending the event joining the effort within minutes of learning about the missing child. Sheriff Robert "Buck" Morrison, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had been enjoying a funnel cake with his grandchildren, immediately shifted into professional mode. He coordinated the search efforts while radioing for additional backup and establishing a command post near the main gate. Becca's yellow dress should have made her easy to spot among the crowd, but as the afternoon wore on and shadows began to lengthen across the fairgrounds, hope started to fade with the dying light. The Ferris wheel operator, a grizzled carnival veteran named Pete, who had been running rides for over 20 years, stopped his attraction and climbed to the top of the wheel to scan the entire fairgrounds from above. From his elevated position, he could see every corner of the fair, every cluster of people, every possible hiding place where a small child might have wandered, but there was no flash of yellow anywhere in his field of vision. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty grounds, Sheriff Morrison made the decision to expand the search beyond the fairgrounds themselves. He contacted the Nebraska State Police, requesting additional personnel and specialized equipment, including search dogs and helicopter support. The traveling carnival that provided most of the rides and games was scheduled to move on to their next location the following morning, so every trailer, every piece of equipment, and every vehicle associated with the carnival was thoroughly searched before anyone was allowed to leave. By evening, the Nebraska State Police had arrived in full force, bringing with them trained search dogs, a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment, and a mobile command unit that served as the nerve center for the expanding investigation. Detective Ray Patterson, a 20-year veteran with the state police who specialized in missing persons cases, took charge of the investigation. His kind eyes and methodical approach had helped solve dozens of cases over his career, but he had never encountered a disappearance quite like this one. Patterson's first step was to interview Linda and Tom Collins multiple times, not because he suspected them of any wrongdoing, but because parents often remembered crucial details in the hours and days following the initial trauma of their child's disappearance. He was particularly interested in the timeline of events, the exact location where Becca was last seen, and any unusual individuals or circumstances that the parents might have noticed during their time at the fair. "I need you to think very carefully," Patterson urged Linda as they sat in the cramped interview room that had been set up in the sheriff's office. "Did you notice anyone watching Becca? Anyone who seemed out of place or showed unusual interest in your daughter?" Linda's hands shook as she held her coffee cup, the liquid growing cold as she struggled to recall every detail of their afternoon at the fair. "There was a man by the pony rides earlier in the day," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had a blue baseball cap, maybe in his 40s. He smiled at Becca when she waved at him, but that didn't seem unusual at the time. Everyone loves kids at the fair, and Becca has always been friendly with strangers. Indeed, the description of the man in the blue baseball cap led to the creation of a composite sketch, but the reality was that hundreds of men at the fair that day matched that general description. Patterson and his team interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, but none could provide additional details that might help identify the mysterious figure. The investigation expanded beyond the fairgrounds themselves, with officers canvassing nearby farms and questioning every person associated with the traveling carnival. The carnival workers were a tight-knit community, many of whom had been traveling together for years and knew each other's backgrounds intimately. They submitted to extensive questioning and background checks, understanding that their cooperation was essential not only for finding Becca, but also for protecting their own reputations and livelihoods. The carnival had permits for 3 more stops in neighboring states, and each location was thoroughly searched by local law enforcement before the rides and games were allowed to move on to their next destination. Tom Collins threw himself into the search with the desperate energy of a man who blamed himself for his daughter's disappearance. He organized volunteer groups that combed through cornfields and checked abandoned barns for miles around the fairgrounds, working 16-hour days and refusing to acknowledge the physical exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. His farmer's knowledge of the local terrain proved invaluable as he guided search teams to remote locations that outsiders might have overlooked. Linda oscillated between hope and despair, spending endless hours at the kitchen table, organizing flyers with Becca's photograph and coordinating with other missing children's advocacy groups that had reached out to offer their assistance. She had connected with parents from across the country who had endured similar tragedies, finding both comfort and additional anguish in their shared experiences. The kitchen that had once been filled with the sounds of Becca's laughter now served as a command center for the search efforts, with telephone calls coming in at all hours from potential witnesses and well-meaning volunteers. The media attention was intense, but unfortunately brief, as the story competed with other news events for the public's limited attention span. For 2 weeks, Becca's photograph appeared on local news broadcasts and in regional newspapers, her innocent smile and bright yellow dress becoming symbols of every parent's worst nightmare. Her school principal, Mrs. Ruth Henderson, led a prayer vigil at the elementary school that was attended by over 300 community members, including families who had never met the Collins but felt compelled to show their support. Yellow ribbons began appearing on mailboxes and car antennas throughout the county, a symbol of hope that gradually faded as summer turned to autumn, and the initial fervor of the search gave way to the grim reality that Becca Collins might never be found. The changing seasons seemed to mock the family's grief, with the corn harvest proceeding as it had for generations, while one small family remained frozen in time, unable to move forward without answers about their missing daughter. Detective Patterson worked the case with unwavering dedication for 3 years before his retirement, following up on every lead, no matter how remote the possibility of success. He maintained detailed files on every aspect of the investigation, creating a comprehensive database of information that he hoped might eventually yield the breakthrough that would bring Becca home. When he finally retired in 1990, he passed the case to younger investigators who brought fresh perspectives and access to new technologies that were revolutionizing law enforcement. The Collins family never recovered from their devastating loss, despite the support of their community and the efforts of grief counselors who tried to help them process their trauma. Tom started drinking heavily, unable to cope with the overwhelming guilt of having left his daughter's side for those crucial minutes when she disappeared. He replayed that decision endlessly in his mind, torturing himself with alternative scenarios where he might have stayed with his family or insisted that they all leave the fair earlier in the day. His marriage to Linda gradually crumbled under the weight of grief and recrimination, with both parents struggling to communicate their pain and find ways to support each other through the darkest period of their lives. They divorced in 1991, both moving to different states in desperate attempts to escape the constant reminders of their missing child and the life they had built together on the Nebraska farm. Linda settled in Oregon, finding work as a school counselor and volunteering with missing children's organizations, while Tom moved to Arizona, taking construction jobs and rarely speaking about his past to new acquaintances. Years passed with occasional false leads and mistaken sightings that would temporarily revive hope before crushing it once again with disappointment. A girl matching Becca's description was spotted at a truck stop in Wyoming in 1993, leading to a multi-state search effort that ultimately revealed she was actually a teenage runaway from Montana who bore only a superficial resemblance to the missing child. Another sighting in Colorado led to a 3-day search involving dozens of law enforcement officers, but again ended in frustration when the girl in question was located and identified as someone completely unrelated to the case. The case files grew thicker with each dead end and false lead, but Detective Patterson's replacement, Detective Maria Santos, refused to let the case grow cold entirely. Santos was a thorough investigator with a particular talent for cold cases, and she periodically reviewed the Becca Collins file, looking for details that earlier investigators might have overlooked or new technologies that could be applied to existing evidence. She maintained contact with both parents, sending them updates on any developments and ensuring that they knew the case remained active despite the passage of time. In 2007, exactly 20 years after Becca's disappearance, Detective Santos received a phone call that would reignite the investigation in the most unexpected way possible. A young woman had walked into a hospital emergency room in Denver, Colorado, in a state of complete confusion and distress, claiming that she had no memory of her identity or her past. The attending physician who examined her noted several unusual aspects of her case that set it apart from typical amnesia cases. The woman, who hospital staff began calling Jane Doe Nurture 47 due to her unidentified status, appeared to be in her mid-20s, with strawberry blonde hair and haunting brown eyes that seemed somehow familiar to Dr. Patricia Morrison, the emergency room physician who first examined her. Jane had been found wandering the streets of downtown Denver in the early morning hours, wearing clean but unremarkable clothes and carrying no identification, no purse, and no personal belongings of any kind. What made Jane's case particularly intriguing was her apparent good physical health, despite clear signs of having been living rough for several days. She was undernourished and dehydrated, but showed no signs of drug use, alcohol abuse, or recent physical trauma that might explain her memory loss. More puzzling was her behavior. She seemed genuinely terrified of something that she couldn't identify or articulate, constantly looking over her shoulder and flinching at sudden movements or loud noises. She kept asking if she was safe, Dr. Morrison later recalled during interviews with investigators, but when we asked her what she was afraid of or what had happened to her, she couldn't explain it. It was as if her fear was deeply embedded in her psyche, but completely disconnected from any conscious memory or understanding of its source. The Denver Police Department initiated their standard procedure for unidentified individuals, fingerprinting Jane and running her information through various state and federal databases in hopes of establishing her identity. When those initial searches came up empty, they expanded their efforts, reaching out to missing persons databases and cold case files across the western United States. Detective Carlos Mendez, assigned to Jane's case, was methodical in his approach, starting with the most recent disappearances and working backward through decades of unsolved cases. It was during this comprehensive search process that Nebraska's missing persons database flagged a potential match that would change everything. The age progression photograph that the Nebraska State Police had commissioned in 1997, showing what Becca Collins might look like as an adult, showed remarkable similarities to Jane Doe, 47. The facial structure, the distinctive brown eye color, even the way she held her head when listening intently to conversations, everything aligned with what investigators believed Becca Collins might look like after 20 years. Detective Santos received the call from Denver on a Tuesday morning in March, just as she was settling in to review another cold case file that had been gathering dust on her desk. Detective Mendez explained the situation carefully, outlining the similarities between Jane Doe, 47, and the age-progressed photographs of Becca Collins, while emphasizing that they were dealing with preliminary observations rather than confirmed facts. The possibility that Becca Collins had been found alive after 2 decades sent shockwaves through the small Nebraska Police Department, where her case had remained an open wound for 20 years. Santos immediately began coordinating with Denver authorities, arranging for DNA samples to be taken from Jane Doe, Becca 47, and preparing for what might be the most significant development in her law enforcement career. The process of obtaining DNA samples for comparison required careful coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Linda Collins, now Linda Patterson, after remarrying a kind man who had helped her heal from her devastating loss, had moved back to Nebraska 5 years earlier to care for her aging mother. She had never completely stopped hoping for news about Becca, but the passage of 20 years had taught her to protect herself from the emotional devastation of false hopes and dead-end investigations. When Detective Santos called to explain the situation in Denver, Linda's initial reaction was cautious skepticism mixed with the familiar flutter of hope that she had learned to suppress over the years. She had been through too many false alarms and mistaken identities to allow herself to believe that this time might be different. But there was something in Santos's voice, a carefully controlled excitement that suggested this case might be unlike the others. "I never let myself believe she was dead," Linda told Santos during their meeting at the police station where she had spent so many agonizing hours 20 years earlier. "But I also couldn't live in constant hope because it was destroying me piece by piece. I learned to exist in this strange space between the two possibilities, accepting that I might never know what happened to my daughter." Tom Collins proved significantly more difficult to locate after all these years of deliberate isolation from his past. He had moved several times within Arizona, taking construction jobs that paid cash, and keeping a deliberately low profile to avoid the painful memories that seemed to follow him wherever he went. When Santos finally reached him by phone after days of detective work, his reaction was immediate and intense. He booked a flight to Denver that same day, unwilling to wait for official confirmation of the DNA results that might provide the answers he had been seeking for 2 decades. The DNA results took 3 agonizing weeks to process, during which time Jane Doe, 47, remained in the protective custody of Denver Social Services while undergoing comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in dissociative disorders and trauma recovery, was brought in to assess Jane's mental state and develop treatment strategies for whatever revelations the DNA testing might bring. Dr. Chen's initial evaluation revealed a complex psychological profile that raised more questions than it answered. Jane displayed symptoms consistent with severe dissociative amnesia, but her case was complicated by several unusual factors. Unlike most amnesia patients who retain some fragments of memory or emotional connections to their past, Jane showed no recognition of her own identity, her personal history, or even basic facts about her life before appearing in Denver. "The completeness of her memory loss is extraordinary," Dr. Chen explained to the investigative team during one of their regular briefings. "Most patients with dissociative amnesia retain islands of memory. fragments of childhood, emotional responses to familiar stimuli, or unconscious behavioral patterns that reflect their past experiences. Jane shows none of these typical markers. When the DNA results finally arrived, confirming beyond any doubt that Jane Doe, Nusher 47, was indeed Rebecca Collins, the news triggered a complex chain of emotions and logistics that no one had been fully prepared to handle. The missing 6-year-old girl who had disappeared from a county fair in Nebraska had been found alive as a 26-year-old woman with no memory of her identity or her past. The reunion between Rebecca and her parents, when it finally happened at the Denver hospital, was nothing like what anyone had imagined during the 20 years of hoping and waiting. Rebecca studied their faces with the curiosity of someone meeting complete strangers, polite but emotionally distant. The yellow dress, the ribbon in her hair, the day at the county fair, none of it registered in her consciousness. She showed no flicker of recognition when Linda spoke to her in the gentle voice that had once been so familiar, no response to the pet names and family references that had been such an integral part of her childhood. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that no one could immediately identify or place. "I wish I could remember you. I can see in your eyes that you love me very much, but I don't know who I am or how I got to this place. Everything before a few days ago is just darkness." The investigation into Rebecca's missing 20 years became the focus of a joint task force involving law enforcement agencies from multiple states, federal authorities, and specialists in long-term missing persons cases. The first breakthrough came when Rebecca began experiencing fragments of memory during intensive therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, though these weren't coherent memories but rather emotional impressions and sensory details that seemed to emerge from her subconscious without context or explanation. During one particularly intense session, Rebecca began describing sensory memories: the smell of pine trees mixed with something metallic and unpleasant, the sound of a specific type of country music playing repeatedly, the feeling of cold concrete against her bare feet, and an overwhelming sense of isolation and confinement. These fragments painted a disturbing picture of captivity, but without the narrative structure that would allow investigators to understand what had happened to her or where she had been held. Gradually, through weeks of careful therapy and patient investigation, a picture began to emerge of a life lived in complete isolation and psychological control. Rebecca's fragmentary memories suggested that she had been held in a rural location, possibly a cabin or farmhouse, where she had been completely cut off from the outside world for her entire captivity. The lack of any missing person reports matching her description during her adult years indicated that whoever had taken her had been extremely careful to keep her hidden from society. Dr. Chen worked with Rebecca for months, using various therapeutic techniques to help her process the gradual return of memory fragments while protecting her mental health from the potentially devastating impact of recovered trauma. The sessions revealed a complex psychological landscape shaped by years of isolation and control, with Rebecca's captor apparently using sophisticated manipulation techniques to maintain dominance over her thoughts and actions. Dissociative amnesia of this magnitude typically results from severe, prolonged psychological trauma, Dr. Chen explained to the Collins family during one of their regular update meetings. The mind essentially protects itself by blocking access to memories that are too painful to process consciously. The fact that Rebecca has no recollection of her childhood, her family, or even her own name suggests that whatever happened to her during those 20 years was profoundly traumatic. The breakthrough that would ultimately lead to solving the case came from an unexpected source during one of Rebecca's therapy sessions. She had been experiencing recurring nightmares about a yellow school bus and the sound of children playing. images that seemed to trigger intense anxiety and emotional distress. During one controlled session, Dr. Chen mentioned hearing a specific song that had been playing in the hospital's waiting area, Sweet Caroline by Neil Diamond. Rebecca's reaction to the song was immediate and visceral, triggering what appeared to be a panic attack combined with a flood of memory fragments. She began speaking in a voice that sounded younger, more childlike, describing scenes and experiences that provided the first concrete clues about her captivity and the identity of her captor. "He used to play that song over and over when he was working," she whispered through her tears, her entire body shaking with the force of the recovered memory. "When he was happy, he would sing along and dance around the room. When he was angry or frustrated, he would turn it up so loud that I couldn't hear myself think or even speak." This detail, combined with Rebecca's other fragmentary memories of rural isolation, specific types of music, and the physical characteristics of her prison, led investigators to focus their search on properties in rural Colorado and Wyoming, where someone could have held a child captive for decades without detection from neighbors or authorities. The search was methodical and painstaking, involving satellite imagery analysis, cross-referencing of property ownership records with known sex offenders and individuals with histories of child-related crimes, and coordination with local law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Detective Mendez coordinated the massive search effort, working closely with FBI specialists who had experience with long-term captivity cases and the psychological profiles of individuals capable of such crimes. They developed a detailed profile of Rebecca's likely captor based on her limited but increasingly specific memories. A man who craved absolute control over another human being, lived in geographic isolation that would prevent detection, and possessed the financial resources and psychological sophistication to maintain a hidden captive for decades without being discovered. The specific reference to Sweet Caroline and other music from the 1970s and early 1980s suggested someone who had been an adult during that era, making him likely to be in his 60s or 70s by 2007. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Rebecca remembered a highly specific visual detail during a breakthrough therapy session, a red barn with a distinctive weather vane shaped like a running horse. She described this image with remarkable clarity and detail, her voice taking on the cadence of someone much younger as she spoke about watching the weather vane spin in the wind from a small window in what she described as her room. This specific architectural detail was unusual enough to significantly narrow their search parameters. Property records and satellite imagery from rural Colorado and eastern Wyoming revealed several properties with red barns, but only a handful featured the distinctive horse-shaped weather vane that Rebecca had described with such precision and emotional intensity. One property stood out immediately to investigators, a 200-acre cattle ranch owned by Harold Williamson, a 73-year-old widower who lived alone in a remote area of eastern Colorado with no close neighbors and a well-established reputation for keeping to himself. The property featured not only a red barn with a horse weather vane, but also the type of isolated location that would make long-term captivity possible without detection. What made Williamson particularly interesting to the investigative team was his personal background and history. Property records showed that he had purchased the ranch in 1983, paying cash for both the land and existing structures, just 4 years before Becca's disappearance from the Nebraska County Fair. Even more compelling was his employment history. Williamson had worked as a traveling salesman throughout the 1980s, covering a territory that included Nebraska, Kansas, and eastern Colorado. His sales route would have taken him through the exact area where the county fair was held, and employment records from his former company showed that he had been working in that region during the specific week of Becca's disappearance. The convergence of geographic proximity, timing, and the physical description of his property created a compelling case for surveillance and investigation. The decision to approach Williamson's ranch required extensive planning and coordination among multiple law enforcement agencies. If he was indeed Rebecca's captor, there was no way to predict how he might react to the sudden appearance of law enforcement personnel on his property. The FBI's hostage rescue team was placed on standby, while local SWAT teams prepared for multiple scenarios, including the possibility that Williamson might attempt to flee, destroy evidence, or harm himself rather than face capture. Detective Mendez coordinated with the tactical team leaders, emphasizing the critical importance of taking Williamson alive so that he could provide answers about Rebecca's missing 20 years and potentially help with her ongoing recovery process. The psychological profiles suggested that he was more likely to surrender than to engage in violent resistance, but law enforcement couldn't afford to take chances with such a high-stakes operation. On a cold morning in April 2007, as the sun crested the horizon over the Colorado plains, law enforcement officers from multiple agencies surrounded Williamson's ranch in a carefully coordinated operation designed to prevent escape while minimizing the risk of violence. The property was exactly as Rebecca had described in her recovered memories. Isolated, well-maintained, with the distinctive red barn topped by the horse-shaped weather vane that had triggered her breakthrough in therapy. Smoke was rising from the farmhouse chimney, indicating that Williamson was likely inside and awake, probably following the same morning routine that he had maintained for decades of isolated living. The officers moved into position silently, establishing perimeters and communication protocols, while specialized units prepared to approach the main house where Williamson presumably lived alone. The arrest itself was surprisingly anticlimactic, given the magnitude of the case and the 20-year investigation that had led to this moment. When officers knocked on Harold Williamson's door and identified themselves as law enforcement, he answered calmly and showed no surprise at their presence. He was dressed in clean work clothes and appeared to have been preparing for another ordinary day of ranch work, but his demeanor suggested that he had been expecting this confrontation for some time. "I wondered when you would finally find me," Williamson said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of resignation rather than defiance or fear. "I've been expecting this day for a long time. Probably longer than you might think." Williamson's confession, given over several hours of careful questioning by experienced investigators, revealed a story of obsession, control, and psychological manipulation that explained not only Rebecca's disappearance, but also her complete loss of memory about her previous life. He had first spotted her at the county fair and become immediately fixated on what he described as her innocence and natural beauty, qualities that he felt were being corrupted by the modern world around her. When the opportunity presented itself, Tom's brief absence to use the restroom, Linda's distraction during her conversation with her sister, Williamson had simply approached Becca with the confidence of someone who had been planning such an action for years. He claimed to be a friend of her parents, who had been sent to find her because of an emergency, and 6-year-old Becca had taken his hand without question or suspicion. "She was so trusting and innocent," Williamson told investigators, his voice completely devoid of emotion or remorse. "I told her that her mother had sent me to find her, that there had been a terrible accident, and she needed to come with me right away. She believed me completely and came with me willingly." The drive to Colorado had taken most of the night, with Becca sleeping in the back of Williamson's specially modified van for much of the journey. By the time she woke up, they were hundreds of miles from Nebraska, and Williamson had begun the systematic psychological process of erasing her connection to her previous life and replacing it with a new reality that served his needs. He told her that her parents had died in the car accident that he had supposedly rescued her from, that he was actually her grandfather who had been searching for her for years, and that they needed to live very quietly on his ranch to stay safe from dangerous people who might want to hurt her. For a traumatized 6-year-old child, suddenly separated from everything familiar and comforting in her world, Williamson's lies became her new reality. Williamson was careful never to leave Rebecca alone during the early years of her captivity, gradually convincing her that the outside world was filled with dangers that only he could protect her from. He homeschooled her using carefully selected materials that reinforced his version of reality, never allowing her access to television, radio, newspapers, or any other source of information that might contradict his constructed narrative about their relationship and her past. The ranch house contained heartbreaking evidence of Rebecca's 20 years of captivity that deeply affected even the experienced investigators who processed the crime scene. Her bedroom, if it could be called that, was sparse and institutional. A single narrow bed, a small dresser containing plain clothes, and shelves lined with books that Williamson had deemed appropriate for her education. There were no mirrors anywhere in the room, no access to windows that faced the main road, and no personal belongings that might have connected her to the outside world. Most telling were the journals that Rebecca had kept throughout her captivity, documenting years of loneliness, confusion, and gradual acceptance of her isolated existence. The entries were written in the careful, controlled handwriting of someone who had been educated but never allowed to develop her own voice or perspective on the world around her. The early entries showed a child's confusion and grief, while later entries revealed the psychological adaptation of someone who had learned to survive by accepting her captor's version of reality. Dr. Chen worked intensively with Rebecca for many months following Williamson's arrest, helping her process the devastating revelation of her true identity and the circumstances of her captivity. The journey towards psychological healing was complicated by the fact that Rebecca had no memories of physical or sexual abuse beyond the overwhelming psychological trauma of isolation and manipulation. In some ways, this makes Rebecca's recovery more challenging than cases involving more obvious forms of victimization, Dr. Chen explained to the Collins family during one of their regular counseling sessions. She doesn't have the clear narrative of physical abuse that many survivors work through in therapy. Instead, she has to reconcile the fact that someone she viewed as a protective caregiver was actually the person who stole her childhood and her family. The legal proceedings against Harold Williamson moved through the court system with surprising speed, largely because of his complete confession and cooperation with authorities. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping, child endangerment, false imprisonment, and multiple other charges related to Rebecca's captivity, receiving a sentence of life in prison without any possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, Williamson showed no remorse for his actions and no understanding of the devastation he had caused to Rebecca and her family. Instead, he expressed what he claimed was genuine love for Rebecca and maintained his conviction that he had provided her with a safe, stable, and educational environment that was superior to what she would have experienced in the outside world. Rebecca, who was slowly learning to use her birth name again after 20 years of being called by the identity that Williamson had created for her, chose not to attend his sentencing hearing. She was still in the early stages of rebuilding relationships with her biological parents, a process that was complicated by decades of separation and the fundamental reality that she was essentially a stranger who happened to share their DNA. Tom Collins, who had achieved sobriety for the first time in decades upon learning that his daughter was alive, approached the reunion with careful patience and realistic expectations. He understood that the little girl he had lost at the county fair was gone forever, replaced by a woman who bore her face but carried none of their shared memories or experiences. Linda struggled more significantly with the emotional complexity of the situation, torn between overwhelming gratitude that her daughter was alive and profound grief for the 20 years of relationship that could never be recovered. She had spent decades imagining what Becca might look like as an adult, what her interests might be, what kind of person she would become. But none of those fantasies had prepared her for the reality of a daughter who looked at her with polite interest, but no recognition or emotional connection. The media attention surrounding Rebecca's recovery was intense, but mercifully brief, as her story captured national headlines for several weeks before being displaced by other news events. Television producers competed aggressively for exclusive interviews and book rights, while journalists from across the country descended on the small Nebraska community where the story had begun 20 years earlier. Rebecca, however, made the deliberate choice to maintain her privacy and control the narrative surrounding her recovery. Working with a small team of legal advisors and media consultants, she limited her public appearances and carefully managed the information that was released about her case, understanding that her ongoing healing process required protection from excessive public scrutiny. As Rebecca began the slow, difficult process of integration into a world that had continued evolving without her for 20 years, she made several important decisions that surprised those around her. Rather than attempting to reclaim her childhood or dwelling on what had been taken from her, she chose to focus her energy on building a meaningful future that incorporated both her tragic past and her hopes for recovery. She enrolled in community college courses, initially focusing on general education requirements while she explored different areas of academic interest. Eventually, she gravitated towards psychology and counseling, driven by a desire to understand her own experience and potentially help other survivors of long-term captivity and psychological trauma. "I can't get back the 20 years that were stolen from me," Rebecca told Dr. Chen during one of their final regular therapy sessions. "But I can use what I learned during those years, both the pain and the strength I developed to survive it, to help other people find their way back from similar darkness." The case of Becca Collins fundamentally transformed how law enforcement agencies across the country approached long-term missing person investigations. Her recovery after 2 decades proved that hope should never be completely abandoned, even when cases seemed to have exhausted all investigative possibilities and leads had grown cold. Detective Santos, who was nearing retirement when Rebecca was found, kept the original missing person file in her desk drawer as a constant reminder of the importance of persistence and thoroughness in cold case investigations. The techniques developed during Rebecca's psychological recovery also influenced treatment protocols for other survivors of extended captivity, providing valuable insights into the long-term effects of psychological manipulation and isolation. Today, Becca Collins lives quietly in a small Colorado mountain town, working as a victims advocate with a non-profit organization that specializes in missing and exploited children cases. She continues her education in psychology and counseling, with plans to eventually earn advanced degrees that will allow her to work more directly with trauma survivors. She maintains regular contact with both of her parents, though their relationships continue to evolve and develop as they navigate the complex emotions surrounding their reunion. The bonds they are building are different from the parent-child relationships that were severed by her disappearance, but they are genuine and meaningful in their own right. The yellow dress that 6-year-old Becca wore to the county fair was never recovered, despite extensive searches of Williamson's property and belongings. However, Rebecca keeps a photograph of herself wearing that dress on her office desk, not as a monument to what was taken from her, but as a reminder of the innocent child who somehow survived 20 years of psychological imprisonment and emerged with the strength and determination to help others find their way back to the light. The yellow ribbon that Linda Collins had tied to their old mailbox 20 years earlier is still there, now joined by dozens of others placed by neighbors and community members who never forgot the little girl who vanished at the county fair. It serves as a symbol not just of the tragedy that befell one family, but of the hope that persists even in the darkest circumstances, and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, the lost can be found and brought home again.